On the night of October 18, 1940, 7 German submarines surrounded Convoy SC-7 in the North Atlantic. The Wolfpack had been tracking the 35 merchant ships for 2 days, shadowing them just beyond the horizon, waiting for darkness. At dusk, they struck. Otto Kretschmer, commanding U-99, did something no submarine captain was supposed to do. He drove his boat directly into the middle of the convoy, surfacing between the columns of merchant ships. For 6 hours, the Wolfpack tore the convoy apart. 20 vessels sank beneath the freezing waves. Not a single U-boat was lost. 3,000 miles away, in a laboratory at Birmingham University, 2 British physicists named John Randall and Harry Boot were testing a device the size of a man's fist. They called it a cavity magnetron. It produced radar waves so short and so powerful that it could detect a submarine's periscope from miles away. The Germans had never seen anything like it. They had no way to detect it. They did not even know it existed, and within 3 years, it would help destroy the same Wolfpacks that were tearing Allied convoys apart. Admiral Karl Donitz believed his submarines would strangle Britain into submission. He was about to learn that technology moves faster than torpedoes. The confidence of the German submarine command had been built over decades of careful planning and bitter experience. Donitz himself had conceived the Wolfpack strategy while sitting in a British prisoner of war camp in 1918. As a young commander of UB-68, he had attacked a Mediterranean convoy alone. He sank just 1 ship before the convoy outran him. He was captured when his submarine malfunctioned during a dive. For months in that camp, he thought about what had gone wrong. The lesson burned into his memory with absolute clarity. A single submarine could not defeat an escorted convoy. The boats were too slow underwater to keep up. They could not reload torpedoes fast enough. 1 submarine meant 1 attack, and then the convoy escaped. But multiple boats attacking simultaneously from different directions could overwhelm any defense. He spent the next 20 years refining the concept, writing papers, conducting exercises, building the doctrine that would guide German submarine warfare when the next war came. The operational process he developed was methodical and devastating. Donitz deployed patrol lines of 6 to 30 U-boats stretched across the likely convoy routes like tripwires across a dark room. The first boat to spot a convoy became the Shadower. It maintained contact at the edge of visual range, careful not to be seen, while transmitting position reports by radio to U-boat command headquarters at Courneval in occupied France. From there, Donitz personally directed other boats to converge on the target. When sufficient numbers had gathered, he gave the signal to attack, usually after dusk, when darkness favored the submarines. Each commander was then free to choose his own approach and select his own targets. The genius of the system lay in its exploitation of the submarine's dual nature. Wolfpacks struck at night on the surface, where their low silhouettes avoided visual detection and where the British sonar called ASDIC, designed to find submerged targets, was completely useless. A surfaced U-boat was faster than most merchant ships. It could run down a convoy, position itself ahead, and attack as the ships sailed past. It was nearly invisible against the dark water, just a grey shape lower than the waves. But the system had a fatal dependency that Donitz never fully appreciated. Every contact report, every assembly signal, every order from headquarters transmitted on high-frequency radio, encrypted by the Enigma machine. The Germans believed Enigma was unbreakable. They had studied its mathematics and concluded that the number of possible settings was so astronomical that no one could crack it by brute force. They staked the entire U-boat war on that belief. What made the early Wolfpacks so effective was not just tactics but also intelligence. Germany operated a signals intelligence service called B-Dienst, the observation service, employing thousands of people under a brilliant cryptanalyst named Wilhelm Tranow. By 1935, B-Dienst had broken the most widely used British naval code. By late 1941, it had cracked British Naval Cipher No. 3, the convoy code used for all Allied North Atlantic convoy communications between British, American, and Canadian navies. The results were devastating for the Allies. Between December 1942 and May 1943, B-Dienst read the majority of intercepted convoy messages, though only about 10% were decrypted in time for operational action. Allied communications often contained far more data than necessary, data that Donitz exploited ruthlessly. convoy size, assembly points, speed, heading, straggler rendezvous locations, escort numbers and types. B-Dienst analysts could identify which convoys were weak and which were heavily defended. A remarkable situation emerged by early 1943. At Bletchley Park in England, British codebreakers were reading much of the German submarine traffic through their own Enigma decrypts, which they called Ultra. At the same time, B-Dienst was reading much of the Royal Navy's traffic through the compromised Cipher No. 3. Both sides were eavesdropping on each other. Neither fully understood how much the enemy knew. It was a shadow war fought with pencils and radio receivers, and its outcome would determine who lived and who died in the convoy battles. The proof of the Wolfpack concept came spectacularly in October 1940. On October 18 through 19, 7 U-boats attacked Convoy SC-7. It was a slow convoy of small, aging ships, many of them carrying timber and iron ore from Nova Scotia. The escorts were few and poorly equipped. Kretschmer and his fellow commanders slipped between the columns of ships like wolves among sheep. They sank 20 of 35 vessels, nearly 80,000 tons of shipping and cargo gone in a single night. The following night, 5 boats struck Convoy HX-79 and sank 12 of 49 ships, despite stronger escorts of 2 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 trawlers, and a minesweeper. The escorts charged back and forth, dropping depth charges, firing star shells, but they could not find the submarines attacking from within their own formation. Combined, the Wolfpacks destroyed 32 ships from both convoys over several days. 28 of those ships went down in a concentrated 48-hour assault. No U-boats were lost in either engagement. The Germans called it the Night of the Long Knives. It seemed to prove everything Donitz had argued for 20 years. The commanders who led these early attacks became legends in Germany, their faces on magazine covers, their exploits celebrated in newsreels. Otto Kretschmer of U-99 was the highest-scoring submarine ace of the Second World War. He sank 47 ships, totaling 274,000 tons in just 18 months of combat patrols. His motto was, 1 torpedo, 1 ship. He never wasted ammunition. Of 116 torpedoes he fired in action, 74 found their targets, a success rate of approximately 64% when the fleet average was closer to 30. His tactic was terrifyingly bold. He penetrated inside the convoy columns on the surface at night, sailing among the merchant ships as if he belonged there, firing at point-blank range where he could not miss. When British Captain George Creasy, then Director of Anti-Submarine Warfare, learned from interrogated prisoners how Kretschmer operated, he thought at first that it must have been done by mistake. No sane commander would deliberately sail into the middle of an escorted convoy, surrounded by ships that could ram him, with depth charges falling all around. But Kretschmer did it patrol after patrol. His war diary captured his contempt for the early escorts during the SC-7 attack. He wrote that the destroyers were at their wits' end, shooting off star shells the whole time to comfort themselves and each other. Not that that made much difference in the bright moonlight, he added. Gunther Prien of U-47 earned the nickname the Bull of Scapa Flow after executing one of history's most audacious submarine raids. On October 14, 1939, just 6 weeks after the war began, he navigated his boat through treacherous tidal currents and sunken block ships into the heavily defended Royal Navy anchorage at Scapa Flow. The defences there were considered impenetrable. Prien found a gap. He torpedoed the battleship HMS Royal Oak at anchor. 835 of her crew died, many of them trapped below decks as the old ship capsized and sank in minutes. Even Churchill, in a speech to Parliament, acknowledged it as a remarkable exploit of professional skill and daring. Prien returned to Germany a national hero. Hitler decorated him personally. Joachim Schepke of U-100 pioneered the tactic of attacking from inside convoys, which Donitz soon endorsed fleet-wide, and which Kretschmer perfected. On a single night in September 1940, during an attack on convoy HX-72, Schepke sank 7 ships, totaling over 50,000 tons in just 3 hours. He was dashing and photogenic, the U-boat service's ideal poster boy. All 3 of these legendary commanders were lost within 10 days of each other in March 1941, a catastrophe for German morale that was kept quiet by the propaganda ministry. Prien disappeared on the night of March 7th. His boat was never found. Kretschmer was captured and Schepke was killed on March 17 during an attack on convoy HX-112. Schepke's death carried particular significance that the Germans did not fully understand at the time. U-100 was detected by Type 286 radar aboard the destroyer HMS Vanoc. It was the first U-boat ever detected by ship-mounted radar in the entire war. A new technology had found a submarine that should have been invisible. Schepke was standing on his bridge when Vanoc emerged from the darkness and rammed his boat. He was crushed against the periscope housing. Only 6 of his 44 crew survived. That radar detection was a warning of what was coming, but the German High Command dismissed it as a fluke, a lucky sighting in unusual conditions. They did not understand its significance. They would learn. After Germany declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, Dönitz immediately planned an operation he called Paukenschlag, which translates to drumbeat. He wanted to strike American coastal shipping before the Americans could organize defenses. He requested 12 long-range Type 9 submarines, boats big enough to cross the Atlantic and operate off the American coast for weeks. He was given only 5. The Naval High Command did not share his priorities. Reinhard Hardegen, commanding U-123, was the first to reach American waters. He was provided with 2 tourist guides to New York, one with a fold-out map of the harbor, since no German military charts of the American coast were available. It was an absurd situation. A combat submarine navigating by a guidebook meant for vacationers. British intelligence tracked the U-boats across the Atlantic. Roger Wynn's submarine tracking room at the Admiralty correctly warned Admiral Ernest King, commander of the United States Fleet, of a heavy concentration of U-boats off the North American seaboard. The British had been fighting submarines for 2 years. They knew what was coming. The warnings were ignored. King faced a genuine shortage of escort vessels, but he also distrusted British advice. American defenses were catastrophically poor. Coastal cities blazed bright with lights, silhouetting merchant ships for U-boat commanders watching from offshore. Dönitz could not believe his luck when reports came back. Admiral Adolphus Andrews, commanding the eastern sea frontier, refused to organize convoys, saying it would only provide the U-boats with more targets. This was exactly wrong. Decades of analysis had proven that convoys worked, but Andrews did not have the ships to escort them anyway. Merchant shipping sailed on regular routes, on predictable schedules, with navigation lights burning. The captains had not adjusted to wartime conditions. Many did not believe the war would come to them. The first organized American coastal convoy did not sail until mid-May 1942, more than 5 months after the U-boats arrived. The first successful American U-boat kill did not occur until April 14, 1942, when the destroyer USS Roper sank U-85 off Cape Hatteras. In those months before effective countermeasures, the submarines operated almost without opposition. Hardegen entered New York Harbor at night and saw the city with all lights burning. He could see the glow of Times Square reflecting off the clouds. He wrote in his log that he could not describe the feeling with words, but it was unbelievably beautiful and great. Off Cape Hatteras, watching ship after ship sail past his periscope, he noted that it was a pity there were not 10 or 20 submarines there. Instead of just one, he could not attack them all. He had to choose. On April 10, 1942, he torpedoed the tanker SS Gulf America off Jacksonville Beach, Florida. The ship burned within sight of shore while vacationers on the beach watched the flames climb into the night sky. The merchant seamen who sailed through these waters faced death with no weapons to fight back. They were civilians, not military personnel. When a torpedo struck, they had minutes or sometimes seconds to abandon ship. Those who made it into lifeboats often drifted for days before rescue. Many died of exposure in the freezing North Atlantic water. Others watched shipmates burn in pools of flaming oil, yet they continued to sail, voyage after voyage, because the cargo had to get through. The second happy time, as the Germans called it with grim satisfaction, was the costliest defeat of the war in raw material terms. 609 ships, totaling 3.1 million tons, were sunk for the loss of only 22 U-boats. That was roughly 1/4 of all tonnage sunk by U-boats during the entire war, accomplished in just 8 months. The exchange rate reached approximately 28 ships sunk for each U-boat lost. Historian Michael Gannon called it America's second Pearl Harbor. The difference was that Pearl Harbor lasted 2 hours. The second happy time lasted until August. Hardegen survived the war. He returned to Germany, built an oil trading company, and lived into the 21st century. His company represented, among other clients, Texaco, whose ships he had torpedoed. He visited the United States many times after the war, speaking at naval conferences and historical societies. He died on June 9, 2018, aged 105, the last surviving submarine commander of the Second World War. He told an American newspaper that now he sank putts, not ships. But even as the U-boats chalked up their kills off the American coast, the weapons that would destroy them were already being developed in laboratories and workshops across Britain and America. The single most transformative technology of the Battle of the Atlantic began in that Birmingham University laboratory on February 21, 1940. Physicists John Randall and Harry Boot achieved the first microwave transmission from a cavity magnetron. The device produced 400 watts at 9.8 centimeters wavelength, far shorter than any radar then in existence. Within weeks, engineers improved the output to over 1 kilowatt, then 25 kilowatts, then over 100 kilowatts. The device was small enough to fit in an aircraft and produced resolution far superior to existing meter wavelength radar. It could detect objects that longer wavelength radar simply could not see. Churchill authorized sharing the magnetron with America through a secret mission led by scientist Henry Tizard in September 1940. American officials who examined the device were stunned by what they saw. Historian James Finney Baxter later called it the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. The mission led directly to creation of the MIT Radiation Laboratory, which designed over 100 radar systems during the war. The operational anti-submarine version, called ASV Mark III, entered service with RAF Coastal Command in March 1943. Its first patrol over the Bay of Biscay occurred on March 1st. The first successful attack came on March 18th. The critical advantage was invisibility to German detection equipment. German U-boats had equipped themselves with a radar warning receiver called METOX that was tuned to detect the older ASV Mark II radar, operating on 1.5 meter wavelength. METOX worked brilliantly against that metric radar. It gave crews enough warning to crash dive before aircraft arrived. Submarine losses in the Bay of Biscay had dropped once METOX deployed. But METOX was completely incapable of detecting the new 10-centimeter signals. The frequency was too high. The antenna was wrong. The receiver simply did not respond. The Germans had no idea they were being tracked. Submarines that felt safe were being detected from miles away and attacked without warning. The confusion deepened when a captured RAF crew member fed his interrogators a false story. He claimed that the British were detecting the electromagnetic emissions from the METOX receivers themselves at distances of up to 90 miles. It was nonsense, technically impossible, but the Germans believed it. They conducted experiments that seemed to confirm the story because they were looking for confirmation. In August 1943, the Naval High Command ordered all submarines to turn off their METOX receivers, which actually made the older ASV Mark II radar effective again as well. A submarine captain captured later confessed that while they had felt perfectly safe, they were in fact betraying their bearings to the enemy by using their anti-radar protection. The German countermeasure, called the Naxos receiver, finally arrived in late 1943. It was crude compared to what was needed. A portable stick-mounted unit, it had to be carried up through the conning tower hatch by a crewman and held aloft. It was not waterproof. It had to be removed before diving, which took precious seconds. It had only 8 to 10 miles detection range, giving approximately 1 minute of warning before an aircraft arrived. By the time Naxos deployed in meaningful numbers, the U-boat force was already shattered. The impact of centimetric radar was immediate and measurable. After ASV Mark III arrived in spring 1943, shipping losses fell from 400,000 tons per month to 100,000 tons. The invisible eye in the sky had changed everything. Another weapon came from an unlikely source. Wing Commander Humphrey de Verde Lee was not a technical specialist but an RAF personnel officer, a desk man who had never flown combat. After hearing returning aircrew describe the frustration of losing radar contact on final approach to surfaced U-boats at night, he conceived a solution. He designed and built largely on his own initiative, a 24-inch carbon arc searchlight producing millions of candelas of light. He mounted it in a retractable turret beneath a Wellington bomber. The light could illuminate a submarine from a mile away, turning night into day. He developed the entire system in secret, without official permission or funding. The Air Ministry was unaware of his work until he demonstrated the completed prototype. The operational concept was elegant in its simplicity. An aircraft approached a surfaced U-boat using radar, homing on the target through the darkness. At approximately 1 kilometer, the radar return became unreliable as the target dropped below the minimum detection range. At that moment, exactly when the submarine crew believed they were safe, the Leigh Light switched on. Blazing white light illuminated the boat. A crash dive required 25 to 30 seconds minimum. The U-boat had no time. Crews reported particular terror because the aircraft was invisible and inaudible above their own diesel engines until the moment of blinding illumination. Death came from darkness and silence. The Leigh Light became operational in June 1942. The first confirmed kill came on July 5, 1942, when U-502 was sunk by a Wellington of 172 Squadron, piloted by an American volunteer named Wiley Howell. In the 5 months before the Leigh Light entered service, not a single submarine had been sunk at night in the Bay of Biscay. Donitz ordered all Bay of Biscay boats to proceed submerged both day and night, which slowed their transit times dramatically and exhausted their crews. The German Wolfpack system depended on extensive radio communication, and the Allies exploited this vulnerability with a technology called high-frequency direction finding, nicknamed Huff-Duff. Using cathode ray tube displays with fixed antenna arrays, operators could instantaneously determine the bearing of any radio transmission without mechanically rotating the antenna. U-boat commanders had been trained that keeping transmissions to a few seconds would prevent detection. They wrongly assumed that the traditional rotating loop antennas of direction-finding equipment could not fix their position quickly enough. Huff-Duff proved them catastrophically wrong. An extensive shore-based network across the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, Bermuda, and Canada provided cross-bearings that could triangulate U-boat positions within minutes of a transmission. From 1942 onward, the Allies began installing Huff-Duff sets on escort ships themselves. When a U-boat transmitted a contact report or received orders from headquarters, intercepting operators alerted other Huff-Duff-equipped ships to tune to the same frequency. 2 or more bearings pinpointed the submarine's position. The standard tactic was to run down the bearing at high speed, hoping to catch the U-boat on the surface before it could dive. Huff-Duff was especially devastating against the shadower U-boats tasked with trailing convoys and transmitting the homing signals that assembled the Wolfpacks. Every transmission betrayed their position. The technology that made Wolfpack coordination possible also made Wolfpacks vulnerable. Traditional depth charges suffered a fatal flaw that submarine commanders had learned to exploit. The attacking ship had to pass directly over the submarine and lose sonar contact before dropping charges off the stern. The blind time between losing contact and weapons impact, typically 30 seconds to 2 minutes, gave the U-boat commander time to turn, change depth, accelerate, or stop. A skilled commander could evade almost every attack. Failed attacks produced massive bubble clouds that blinded sonar for minutes more, allowing the submarine to escape. The Hedgehog mortar, developed by the Royal Navy's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, solved both problems. A 24-spigot launcher fired projectiles forward in an elliptical pattern while the ship maintained continuous sonar contact. The attacking ship never passed over the target. Each 65-pound projectile carried 35 pounds of Torpex high explosive and used contact fuses, detonating only on direct hull impact. A miss produced no explosion, meaning sonar remained clear for immediate re-attack. The escort could fire again and again without losing contact. The statistics proved a revolution in lethality. Depth charges achieved 1 kill per 60 attacks, a success rate under 2%. Hedgehog achieved 1 kill per 6 attacks, a success rate of approximately 18%. Hedgehog was nearly 10 times more effective than depth charges per attack. The Mid-Atlantic Gap, which crews called the Black Pit, was a 600-mile-wide zone in the central Atlantic, beyond the range of land-based aircraft from any Allied base. U-boats operated there almost freely, safe from air attack, able to surface and recharge batteries, able to coordinate Wolfpack attacks without interference. Two solutions closed the gap simultaneously in spring 1943. Escort carriers were merchant hulls converted into small aircraft carriers, crude but effective. President Roosevelt overruled Navy opposition, which wanted fleet carriers for offensive operations and demanded a crash construction program. The concept was simple. Put a flight deck on a cargo ship and station it with convoys. The aircraft did not need to be fast or heavily armed. They just needed to find submarines and force them underwater, where they were slow and blind and could not coordinate attacks. USS Bogue, commissioned in September 1942, joined the Atlantic Fleet in February 1943 and became the most successful hunter-killer carrier of the war. Aircraft and escorts working together from Bogue groups sank 13 enemy submarines. No convoy that Bogue escorted lost a single ship to submarine attack. Hunter-killer groups were particularly effective at targeting U-boat refueling rendezvous with milch cow supply submarines, the underwater tankers that allowed combat boats to extend their patrols far from base. Very long-range B-24 Liberators were modified heavy bombers with stripped-out armor, reduced crew, extra fuel tanks, and removed gun turrets. They sacrificed everything for range. They were the only aircraft type that could reach the center of the Atlantic Gap from bases in Iceland, Newfoundland, or Northern Ireland. For approximately 20 months, from June 1941 until early 1943, No. 120 Squadron of RAF Coastal Command was the only VLR Liberator squadron covering the Atlantic Gap, operating from Iceland with roughly 9 or 10 serviceable aircraft at any time. A fierce bureaucratic battle raged throughout this period. RAF Bomber Command under Arthur Harris wanted every long-range aircraft for the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. Admiral Ernest King prioritized the Pacific. The convoys were almost an afterthought. Operational researchers calculated that diverting just a few hundred bombers to maritime patrol would barely affect the bombing campaign, but could be decisive in the Atlantic. Their advice was ignored for months. Even the tiny VLR force proved highly effective. Only one ship was lost in convoy when VLR cover was present. The presence of an aircraft overhead, even if it never attacked, forced submarines to submerge and lose contact with the convoy. The gap was finally closed in May 1943 through a combination of growing VLR aircraft numbers, improved escort carrier deployment, and better coordination between air and surface forces. The Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo, deliberately designated as a mine to conceal its true nature, was perhaps the most innovative weapon of the campaign. Developed in approximately 17 months by the Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory and Bell Telephone Laboratories, it introduced a capability that submarines had no defense against. The weapon was air-launched, a torpedo carrying high explosive. It entered the water after being dropped from low altitude and began a circular search pattern. 4 piezoelectric hydrophones listened for the sound of propellers. When the torpedo detected noise, it turned toward the source and accelerated. It followed the submarine into the deep. Speed was only 12 knots, but a diving submarine was even slower. The boat could not outrun it. The boat could not hide from it. The weapon followed the sound of the propellers themselves. The first operational kill came on May 12, 1943, when an RAF Coastal Command Liberator of 86 Squadron attacked U-456. The acoustic torpedo homed on the damaged boat and struck. The submarine sank later that day. Of over 200 of these torpedoes fired against submarines during the war, dozens achieved kills, and many more caused serious damage, approximately twice as effective as conventional aircraft-launched depth charges. The weapon remained top secret throughout the war. German survivors did not understand what had hit them. The U-boat campaign's greatest tactical success came in March 1943, at the exact moment the tide was about to turn. Convoys HX-229 and SC-122, approximately 100 merchant ships in total, were intercepted by 38 U-boats in the largest convoy battle of the war. For 3 days, the Wolfpack savaged the convoys. 22 merchant ships went to the bottom for the loss of only one U-boat. German radio trumpeted it as the greatest convoy battle of all time. An Admiralty assessment quoted by the Royal Navy's official historian Stephen Roskill concluded that the Germans never came so near to disrupting communication between the New World and the Old as in the first 20 days of March. 1943. A second Admiralty report, circulated only to senior commanders, warned that it appeared possible that Convoy might no longer be an effective system of defense. The situation seemed desperate. But Donitz did not know that every new Allied technology was about to deploy simultaneously. He did not know about the magnetron radar his receivers could not detect. He did not know about the acoustic torpedoes that would follow his boats underwater. He did not know that Bletchley Park had broken back into his communications after a blackout of several months. He saw only the March victory and believed the tide was running his way. Admiral Max Horton, the former submarine ace who now commanded Western approaches as commander-in-chief, requested more destroyers to form dedicated hunting groups. Churchill agreed. Support groups were formed, dedicated hunting forces of experienced warships, freed from convoy escort duty to actively seek out and destroy submarines. Churchill called them cavalry divisions. In April, the exchange rate shifted. For every 3 merchant ships lost, 1 U-boat was destroyed. Horton signaled his commanders that the tide of the battle had been checked and the enemy was showing signs of strain. The battle that broke the Wolfpacks was fought over Convoy ONS-5 in late April and early May 1943. 42 merchant ships, a slow westbound convoy carrying ballast back to North America for another load of war supplies, were escorted by mid-ocean escort Group B-7 under Commander Peter Gretton aboard the destroyer HMS Duncan. His force comprised 2 destroyers, a frigate, 4 corvettes, and 2 rescue trawlers standing by to pick up survivors from torpedoed ships. It was a typical escort, neither especially strong nor especially weak. Opposing them were Wolfpacks totaling 43 U-boats. The battle raged from late April through the first week of May, fought through storms and fog and freezing spray across hundreds of miles of ocean. 13 merchant ships were sunk. The escort seemed to be losing. But the escorts and covering aircraft destroyed 6 U-boats and badly damaged several more. The exchange rate, fewer than 2.5 merchants per U-boat, was catastrophic for Donitz. He could not sustain such losses. On the decisive night of May 5 through 6, 4 U-boats were destroyed in rapid succession. U-638 was sunk by HMS Sunflower on May 5th. Then, overnight, U-125 was rammed and sunk by HMS Oribe. U-531 was destroyed by depth charges from HMS Vidette. U-192 was sunk by HMS Loosestrife. When the first support group arrived as reinforcement, Donitz called off the attack. He had no choice. His boats were dying faster than they could kill. Historians on both sides regard the Battle of Convoy ONS-5 as a turning point in the struggle for the North Atlantic. What followed was annihilation. Convoy SC, 1:30 from mid-May, saw Gretton's B-7 group back in action, with frigates reinforcing and continuous air cover from VLR Liberators. More than 24 U-boats opposed the convoy. The result was total Allied victory. 0 convoy ships lost, 5 U-boats destroyed. Among the dead was U-954, commanded by Odo Loewe. All 47 crew were killed. One of them was 21-year-old Peter Donitz, the Admiral's youngest son. Donitz learned of his son's death while still processing the scale of the disaster befalling his command. In just 2 weeks, multiple convoys passed through the mid-Atlantic with minimal losses while U-boat after U-boat was destroyed. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Donitz ordered the withdrawal of U-boats from the North Atlantic. His war diary attributed the losses to the superiority of enemy location instruments and the surprise from the air which resulted from that superiority. In his post-war memoirs, he was blunter. Radar, he wrote, had robbed the U-boats of their power to fight on the surface. Wolfpack operations against convoys in the North Atlantic were no longer possible. He told his commanders that the withdrawal was only temporary, to avoid unnecessary losses in a period when their weapons were shown to be at a disadvantage, and that the battle in the North Atlantic would be resumed. It never was, not with any success. Peter Donitz had been dead 5 days when his father signed the order. The complete accounting records 42 U-boat losses in May 1943. Of those boats, 33 were lost with all hands. No survivors, no rescue. More than 1,800 men died in that single month. The survivors numbered fewer than 200. The month's losses exceeded the entire year of 1941 and represented roughly a quarter of all operational U-boats. German shipyards in 1943 were producing approximately 24 boats per month. Even at that rate, May's losses far exceeded the replacement capacity. Peter Peterson served aboard U-518 from summer 1943 and gave recorded testimony decades later that captures the experience of being depth-charged. He described being caught by 6 American destroyers after an unsuccessful attack on an escort carrier. His boat went deep as the destroyers made run after run with depth charges. He called it an awful time. They were throwing tons of depth charges at them, explosions all around. There was nothing they could do about it. They had to take it. The ship would shake, the lights would flicker, small leaks might develop. The gauges went past their limit of 230 meters, close to 800 feet. The hull groaned under the pressure. During a depth charge attack, he said, "Everyone is quiet and looks up because that is the direction the noises come from." Some people were chalk white. Others would bounce their legs up and down or pull on their beards. They were encouraged to sleep, but you only pretended to be asleep. Peterson's boat survived after 36 hours submerged, hiding in the deep while the destroyers hunted above. He later reflected that during those 36 hours under attack, he swore to himself that if he ever got out of that mess, he would never let small things bother him again. Captain Frederick John Walker, known throughout the fleet as Johnny Walker, destroyed more U-boats than any other individual commander on either side of the conflict. Admiral Horton said of him that no single officer at sea did more than Johnny Walker to win this battle, the hardest and longest drawn out of the war. Walker developed innovative tactics that other commanders copied throughout the service. His creeping attack used one ship to maintain sonar contact, while directing a second ship to approach the submarine at dead slow speed, moving so quietly that the U-boat's hydrophones could not detect the approaching threat, then dropping charges precisely over the target. His methods lined up multiple ships to saturate an area with continuous depth charge patterns, giving the submarine nowhere to hide. In July 1943, his support group caught 3 large U-boats on the surface in the Bay of Biscay. Walker ordered a general pursuit. His ships scattered in chase. In minutes, Germany lost 2 vital milch cow resupply submarines. In February 1944, his group sank 6 U-boats in a single patrol, an astonishing achievement. He played the tune, "A Hunting, We Will Go Over the Ship's Loudspeakers" when returning to Liverpool after each kill. The crews on the dock knew what it meant when they heard that song echoing across the water. Walker died on July 9, 1944, of cerebral thrombosis caused by overwork and exhaustion. He had driven himself beyond human limits. His son Timothy had already been killed, serving on the submarine HMS Parthian, lost in the Mediterranean in August 1943. The statistic that most clearly captures the reversal of fortune is the exchange rate. In 1939, the Germans sank approximately 19 ships for every U-boat lost. In 1942, the rate was about 13 to 1. In May 1943, it collapsed to approximately 1 to 1. By late 1943, Germany was losing more U-boats than it was sinking merchant ships. The mathematics of the tonnage war, the calculation on which Donitz had staked everything, were permanently broken. Donitz had calculated that sinking 700,000 tons of shipping per month would strangle Britain. After America entered the war, that target effectively doubled to account for American production. The 700,000-ton figure was exceeded only twice during the entire war, in June and November of 1942. After May 1943, monthly sinkings dropped dramatically, falling below 100,000 tons per month by early 1944. Meanwhile, American shipyards produced over 2,700 Liberty ships during the war, averaging 3 ships every 2 days across the entire conflict. At peak production in 1943, they launched even faster. The submarines could not sink ships fast enough to matter. Approximately 40,000 men served in the German U-boat force during the war. Between 28,000 and 30,000 were killed, a casualty rate of approximately 70%, the highest of any major military branch on either side of the conflict. The average age of a U-boat crewman was 22 years old. Most were volunteers who had joined before the tide turned, drawn by the prestige of submarine service and the early successes. They did not know they were joining a death sentence. By the war's final years, as Donitz himself acknowledged at Nuremberg, everyone knew that he took part in an average of 2 missions and then was lost. Yet, he added, they made up their losses and again replenished their forces with volunteers full of enthusiasm and moral strength, just because morale was so high. Winston Churchill, who had served as First Lord of the Admiralty at the start of the war, later wrote in his memoirs that the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. The Battle of the Atlantic lasted from September 1939 to May 1945, longer than any other campaign of the war. More than 30,000 British merchant seamen died, ordinary civilians who sailed unarmed ships through waters prowled by submarines. The campaign was fought across millions of square miles of ocean, from Arctic convoys to Russia to tanker routes off Trinidad, from the coast of Africa to the shores of Brazil. The German failure was not one of courage or seamanship. The 70% casualty rate testifies to that. It was a failure of technological adaptation. The Wolfpacks were optimized for the conditions of 1940 through early 1942. With inadequate escorts, meter-wavelength radar the boats could detect, a mid-ocean gap where no aircraft could reach, and depth charges that could be evaded by a skilled commander. When those conditions changed in a matter of weeks during spring 1943, the entire U-boat war model collapsed. The magnetron that Randall and Boot tested in February 1940 eventually found its way into nearly every Allied warship and patrol aircraft. The Leigh Light that an RAF personnel officer built without permission became standard equipment across coastal command. The Hedgehog mortar that seemed too simple to be effective proved nearly 10 times more lethal than depth charges. The acoustic torpedo that scientists designed in under 2 years tracked submarines by the sound of their own propellers. None of these weapons alone would have won the Atlantic. The older technologies of Huff Duff and improved depth charges and convoy routing based on ultra-intelligence all played their parts. The breaking of German naval enigma at Bletchley Park allowed convoys to be routed around known U-boat concentrations. The expansion of escort forces meant that more ships were available to hunt submarines aggressively rather than simply defending convoys. The training of crews improved steadily as hard-won experience was analyzed and shared. But together, all these factors arriving almost simultaneously in spring 1943, they created a convergence that the German submarine force could neither detect nor counter. The hunters, who had studied American convoy routes with tourist guidebooks, found themselves tracked by weapons they could not see, hunted by aircraft they could not hear, and destroyed by torpedoes that followed them into the depths. The iron coffins that Herbert Werner named in his memoir became the graves of nearly 30,000 young men who volunteered because morale was high and died because technology had moved faster than their training, faster than their equipment, faster than the doctrines their commanders had spent 20 years developing. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans and their families to history enthusiasts discovering these events for the first time. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.